What are accumulators in Spark? So another important interview question. So accumulators is a shared variable used for aggregating values across all Spark executors back to the driver. All right. So a simple definition. So in simple words, accumulator basically accumulates. So it is accumulators are used to collect metrics from a distributed data. So you have this cluster, right, where you will have different nodes that are running and everything. So what accumulators does is it's mainly used to collect the metrics. So they are certain use cases why we use the accumulators. We have if they we want to count the number of errors that we have. Okay, so like there are 10 nodes, we wanted to just basically count the number of errors across all 10 nodes. You can use accumulators for this. If you want to count the number of bad records that we have, number of filtered records we have, is basically, if you want to monitor the ETL pipeline, right? So this is where the accumulators are used. So this is not for business. So this is an important thing. This is accumulators are not meant for business data. So you don't want to write a business logic using accumulators. So these are basically metrics. So what happens is like in Spark, right? Each task runs its own JVM, Java Virtual Machines, and variables are basically copied to each of the executors. So normal variables, whatever you define, they cannot be updated globally. When I say globally, across the cluster. So this is where accumulators are used, where accumulators is a global variable that basically accumulates the data from across all the nodes and gives it back to the driver. Okay. Now, now let's look at one use case, right? We can have a use case. What is the use case that we can have? Okay. So assume that you are running a bank transactions. Okay. So in the bank transaction, it runs in the cluster, right? And this bank transaction, you want to know how many records are invalid, right? How many records are processed successfully. So basically success and failure, right? So how many records are invalid, how many records have successfully processed. But you don't want to store this in your internal HDFS, so you want to use an accumulator for that. So this is where we could use these accumulators to kind of accumulate count how many records have failed, how many records have succeeded. So so one other important thing that we need to understand is, so accumulators, when you are using accumulators, right, always use inside an action. Okay, so always use inside an action. Okay, do not use inside a transformation. Okay, so why this is because Spark, see, there might be some issue when you are running a program, Spark program, there can be some issues, right? So in that case, what Spark will do is Spark will retry certain actions. It can retry the task. Okay. So when it retries the tasks are re-executed. So if they are re-executed, then accumulators can get re-executed again. So it can multiply. So that is where it's always important that you use the accumulator in an action, not a transformation. So if you have something called as map, filter, do not use these accumulators here. So always use accumulators in actions like for each. So this is where we basically use for each, count or collect. So action. So this is a very important thing that you need to keep in mind before using accumulators. Okay. So there are different types of accumulators. So there's something called as long accumulator. So long accumulator for you can count the number of rows using long accumulator. So you can have a double accumulator. You can use double accumulator to sum the values. You can use a custom accumulator for tracking complex objects. So again, different use cases. different types of accumulators that we can use. So now let's look at the code. I've written a simple code here for us to understand accumulators. So let me just run this code first so that while we go through the code, right? So this gets executed. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm using a long accumulator to actually count the number of bad records that we have. So this is an example. This is a data. So we have some log information. So there is time here, there is an ID, the name of the user that we have, and some other value. Okay. So there is some bad data here. So basically, this is one bad data where we are saying that there is a missing timestamp, right? So here it's null. So here we have a missing user ID, and then you have an invalid response code. Okay. So the end we have like 200, 400 response code, and 800 is an invalid response code. So this is the data that we are sending. And what we are trying to identify is we are trying to identify how many bad records are there. So in this example, this is a bad record, this is a bad record, this is a bad record. So there are like three bad records in this data. Okay. Now we are doing some we have a function where we are trying to validate, because you need to tell what is a bad record, right? Accumulator is only for counting, so you need to have that logic in place where we are saying, hey, uh, this is a logic, and if it does not come under this logic, this is a bad record. So we're splitting the fields by comma. A timestamp takes the first field of 0, user ID is the second field, response code is the third field get, and then we are also trying to check if there are any critical fields that are missing. Like for example, if the timestamp is null, or the user ID is empty, or the response code is less than 100, or response code is greater than 599. Some basic logic that we have put, we are basically incrementing. So we are just adding it, right? So, and then what we are doing is like we're passing this to that function, and then we are printing it, right? And then we are seeing like what is the total number of records. So bad records accumulated dot value, and then we are printing it. So that is what we get. Like the total number of bad records is 3, right? So this is what the accumulator does, right? So let me just pull it down a little bit, and let me just go back to the code again. Simple code, what we have, we are using a long accumulator because we want to count the number of bad records. This is a sample log data that we are passing. We have a function that we are using to validate the log entry. Here I'm just checking if timestamp is null, or user ID is empty, or response code is within a certain value. And then if that is the case, then what I'm doing is bad accumulator dot add. So I'm just adding one entry here. So this is a bad accumulator, bad record accumulator that we have defined here. I'm just adding one record to that. And finally, I'm basically printing all that record here, which is basically 3. So this is what accumulator does. All right. So that's all I have this session. I hope you guys understood this, and I'll see you guys in my next session.